Today we welcome Lisa McCubbin, an award-winning journalist and author of 4 New York Times best-selling books. Her new book, Betty Ford, First Lady, Women's Advocate, Survivor, and Trailblazer, is a biography of one of the most admired, influential women of our time. Lisa will be interviewed today by the daughter of President Gerald and Betty Ford, Susan Ford Bales. If you could please join me in welcoming Lisa and Susan Ford Bales.
Good morning. It's so nice to be back in the desert. I'm going to ask Lisa to start the process with how and why, because I really didn't get contacted until after she decided to do the book. So I'll let you start about the whole process and why.
Okay, that sounds great. So you all have this beautiful book, and thank you so much to Jamie for providing these books. Just what a wonderful gift. So I had done 4 other books with as a co-author, and my editor at Simon & Schuster was looking for a project for me. And he had just had lunch with Don Rumsfeld, and they were talking about doing a book together. And he called me up and he said, I just got back to my office, I did some research, and do you know, there has never been a proper biography of Betty Ford. And she passed away in 2011, and I think, Lisa, that you're the perfect person to write her biography. So I must admit, I did not know hardly anything about Betty Ford other than that she had been First Lady, and the Betty Ford Center had her name on it. So I knew I would have to devote 2 years of my life to this project, and I always have to feel passionate about my subject. So I said to my editor, well, let me go take a walk and think about this. So I went on a walk. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. Went around my little town of Tiburon, and on that walk, I kid you not, I ran into 4 people wearing University of Michigan sweatshirts. And then a car drove by with a Michigan license plate. So I took that as a sign, of the first sign, and there were many more signs to come. I contacted Susan, and she graciously agreed to meet with me, and we kind of hit it off.
We did.
And that was the first step, because I knew I needed Susan's buy-in on this, and I needed her voice and her brother's voices to tell Betty's story. And the other sign that kept recurring throughout this process was when Susan and I were leaving her home in Tulsa, we walked out into the courtyard in the front, and a yellow butterfly appeared out of nowhere and came and circled around and did a figure 8 around the 2 of us. And from that point on, I saw yellow butterflies everywhere, and I always said, hello, Betty. So I felt like your mother was with me throughout this entire process. So I talked to Susan, but you only knew a certain part of your mother's story.
Well, that's true, because Lisa did a ton of research on her life before my dad and before us kids and everything else. I knew she lived in Grand Rapids, and I knew she was a dancer and danced with Martha Graham. But Lisa, I learned a whole lot about my mother in this process.
The part about writing a biography is, where do you start? It's kind of predictable to start with Elizabeth Ann Bloomer was born April 8th, 1918. I didn't want to do that, but I needed to research her early life. So my first stop was to go to the Gerald Ford Presidential Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I asked to see what they had about Betty Ford. Well, they had a lot of information about her as First Lady, but nothing from her early life. And they said, well, we have some boxes that we haven't processed yet, that I guess you had gone through.
We had just donated because we were still going through stuff.
And I said, well, I've got a deadline. I have to write this book about Betty Ford. I need to see it. So they graciously allowed me to go through many of those boxes of her memorabilia so that I could piece together her early life. Also, when I was in Michigan, I went to visit where she lived as a child. This is her home at 717 Fountain Street, and that just helped me to kind of put myself in her space. I learned that she was a dancer, and you, of course, knew this. She fell in love with dance at the age of 8. Did she talk to you much about her dancing as a young child?
No, what she talked about is when she was a young child, her mother worked, was president of a hospital called Mary Free Bed in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And Mary Free Bed is a rehabilitation hospital. And so while my grandmother, who I never knew, was doing her board meetings upstairs, my mother was down playing with and teaching the handicapped children how to dance and move.
And and she said that dance was her happiness. So she started out with ballroom dancing and then learned ballet and tap and Latin dancing. She loved every bit of it, but she really fell in love with modern dance. And in the summer of 1936 and 37, she went to a program at Bennington College in Vermont, a summer dance program where she studied under Martha Graham. And one of the things that I found in these boxes were her stacks of memo books where she had taken notes. And this was, to me, like a treasure chest, because here was Betty's own handwriting. You can see Betty Bloomer, and then inside she took these meticulous notes. This is the Martha Graham technique. Now, I'm not a dancer, so I had no idea there was so much to learn about dancing, but to see Betty's own writing, that just really showed me the true passion she had for dance. And then the scrapbooks that she kept, here are some pictures from Bennington College. And then she ended up going as she was 20 years old, she went to New York City. So imagine that. At 20 years old, in 1938 it was, she takes off by herself. She was an independent young woman.
She was a very independent young woman, but from what I've learned about my grandmother was very strong-willed and very independent also. And so what a surprise that it just keeps getting passed down in the family.
And yes, absolutely, it gets passed down. And one of the great things about getting to know Susan is, I really feel like I got to know your mother through you as well, that independence. So Betty went and she danced in New York City for a couple of years, but one thing about Betty was she was very popular. She had a lot of boyfriends. People, she had a lot of dates, I would say, and she liked to socialize. And Martha Graham came to her one day and said, Betty, you have talent, but if you really want to be a, dancer in my troupe, you're going to have to give up your social life. Well, Betty wasn't ready to give up her social life. So she moved back to Grand Rapids and she modeled. So she modeled for Herpelsheimer's department store. And I love this with the cigarette. It was a different era. She was absolutely beautiful. This is actually a later picture of her, but she had a great sense of fashion too. She loved fashion, and that came out of her dancing. She used to make her own costumes.
She did, and when you live on a congressional budget later in life, you have to resort and be very crafty, shall we say, in putting outfits together, but she was very good at it.
And this picture actually is from a Ladies' Home Journal article from, I think it was 1961, and Susan was actually in it too. There's a picture of you with your mother. And the title was, How Mrs. Ford Looks So Great on a Budget. And she gave her tips for having a lot of accessories. And
I actually, that turquoise shawl that she has over her arm went to a two-tone turquoise evening gown that she had made in New York. And I actually have that dress and shawl and have had pictures of my children taken in that dress, so it's very special.
I didn't know that. That's great. So I also learned something about Betty Ford that I didn't know, and maybe a lot of you don't know, but she was married before she was married to Gerald Ford. She was married to a man named Bill Warren. When she moved back to Grand Rapids, she fell in love with Bill Warren, and it didn't work out. She calls it the 5-year misunderstanding. We go into detail in the book about it, but obviously you didn't know him, and she really didn't talk about him to you that much. But after her divorce, she said she was done with men. She was just going to, go out and be an independent woman. She got $1 in her divorce settlement, so things have changed a lot since then. And her divorce was barely final when Jerry Ford came into her life and swept her off her feet. And they got married in 1948. Now, she thought she was marrying a Grand Rapids lawyer. but your father was keeping a secret from her.
Was running for Congress. So I don't know how he could have kept it a secret. I mean, let's think about it. Billboards all over town, Jerry Ford for Congress. But he didn't involve her in it because she was a divorced woman, and he was afraid it would damage his ticket. So you have to think back to when that was, and it was very different. And so, but she didn't realize she was going to Washington after that either. So
Right, exactly. And so they got married October 15th, 1948. He won the election a couple of weeks later, and then they were on their way to Washington, D.C., and basically never left until they came back here.
Yep.
So one thing I did while I was researching their life in Washington is I went to visit the homes they lived in. They lived in a little apartment in Park Fairfax when they were first married, and they started having children right away. Betty was 30 when they got married, and Jerry was 35. So, back then, that was quite mature to be getting married.
Well, he had also been in the Navy, so he didn't get married until he came back from the Korean War. So that's why they were so much older.
And they knew what they were looking for at that point, and I think that's why they hit it off so well. They really clicked. So they had 4 children in rather quick succession. It was Mike, and then Jack, and Steve, and Susan. So as the family grew, then they went into a new house at 514 Crown View Drive. Now that's a picture of me walking up to the house to go knock on the door, which I did at all of these homes, and I said, "Hello, I'm writing a book about Betty Ford, and she used to live here. Do you mind if I come in and take a look around?" And everybody let me in. They were so gracious. Everybody who lived in these homes are so proud that they live in Betty and Gerald Ford's home. So this is where your memories began.
These are my memories, and actually that window in front of the driveway used to be a garage until my dad became vice president, and then the Secret Service moved into the garage. So that's the Secret Service command post. Above that window was my parents' bedroom, and it was a 4-bedroom house, 2.5 bathrooms. I mean, it's a salt brick plain house, no formal dining room. We had a eat-in kitchen, which was in the previous photo. It was not a formal house whatsoever. It was very simple, and I think they, spent $30-some thousand building that house.
Right. And when the Secret Service came in, they put $50,000 into the house. And your father said, when he found out, he said, "You gotta be kidding me, that's more than I paid for the house." And you shared a bathroom with your brothers for all those years.
For many, many years. Except for when we did the Secret Service conversion, I had this ginormous closet in my bedroom that my mother put a lot of her clothes in. And I said, could I at least have a sink and a john? I don't need a shower. I'll go in and still shower with the boys. But could I just have something of my own? And so we took half of the closet, and put a half bath in my room, which was a nice addition.
So growing up in this house, here's one of my favorite photos. I mean, your mom she was a congressman's wife. She was a housewife, and she took care of all 4 of you kids. What kind of mother was she?
She was really a pretty incredible mother. That's before my dad put the swimming pool in. We eventually put a swimming pool in that backyard. But I had to be 5 before they would allow a swimming pool because mother said, "Susan's got to be able to swim the length of the pool. I'm not going to have any kids drowning in our backyard." So, but mother was there. She was one of those that if one of the boys, or probably the boys more so than me, if she wasn't in the Alexandria emergency room once a week, they thought something was wrong at the Ford house. So when you have 3 boys, any of you who have boys, it's very different, as you well know. But Dad traveled most of the week. He would go back to Michigan and be in his district and do what he had to do. In those days, the families lived in Washington. And, we got to know everybody, and those were the days when everybody got along, and there was not going on what's going on now. So,
yeah, exactly. And, your father, one of his best friends was Hale Boggs.
Hale Boggs, Tip O'Neill, John, I mean, those were all his good buddies, and they didn't always agree on everything politically, but they got along as friends.
So one day it was in 1964, Betty was leaning across it's odd to say Betty, it's your mother, but she's Betty to me. Betty was leaning across the kitchen sink to open up the window above the kitchen sink, probably to yell at one of the boys doing something in the backyard.
Or Steve coming out of his window, which was above the kitchen.
And that night, she woke up in excruciating pain. She couldn't move. She didn't want to wake up her husband, but she somehow made it downstairs, and she thought if she could stretch, she was a dancer, she could stretch it out, she would feel better. Nothing was working, and he came down in the morning to find her just in this excruciating pain and took her to the emergency room, and it turned out she had a pinched nerve in her neck. Mm-hmm. So they couldn't operate. It was too close to the spinal column, and so the only thing they could do is put her in traction and give her high doses of pain medications. So she was in the hospital for a couple of weeks, and finally they let her go, and she said to the doctor, well, what about if I'm out somewhere and the pain comes back, what do I do? And the doctor said, don't let that happen. You take those pain pills every 4 hours. And that's how it all started.
That's how it all started.
So, I think a lot of people don't know that, and that's what's woven through the book is to her whole journey. We all know how wonderful it ended, but there are so many bits and pieces. So let's fast forward from when you were little to this. So Spiro Agnew resigns, and your dad was on the short list to become vice presidential nominee. And tell us about the $5 bet.
Well, I was in boarding school at the time in Bethesda, Maryland, but I would come home every weekend, and I came home that Friday, and Mother was just bedraggled. I mean, the press were sitting in the front yard, they were camped out in the front yard, and Sam Donaldson, if any of you remember Sam Donaldson, and we used to have our phone number in the phone book, because that's what you did, right? So they would call like every 30 minutes. And my mother goes, I am just exhausted. I'm going to go up and take a nap. And I said, no problem. I'll answer the phone. I'm a junior in high school, who knows everything. So I answered the phone, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I couldn't believe it, because I really hadn't thought about my dad being on the short list. And so Mother got up from her nap, and we talked about it. And she goes, oh, well, I don't believe that your father is going to, make it on the short list. What she didn't know in the background is that people like, John O'Connell and all these people were telling President Nixon, the only person we will take is Jerry Ford. He's nonpartisan, he has been around, he knows the ropes of the Capitol and everything else. So I made a bet with Mother, and I said, I'll bet your dad is it. And she said, no, he's not going to be it. Well, I said, just in case, let's go pick out a dress in case you have to go to the White House. If any of you knew my mother, punctuality was not a star point. And so it was like, how can we have her prepped and ready to go? And the news people were going, well, you went and got your hair done today. And she goes, I get my hair done every Friday.
Yeah.
I didn't get it done because I knew something was going to happen. So that particular night, Dad came home. Of course, he was mum. He knew what was going to happen. And he did tell, Steve was home and I was home. Jack and Mike were off in college at that stage. And Dad said at the dinner table, the president's going to call the family of whoever is going to become vice president like 7 o'clock-ish. And so we were all eating dinner, and the phone rang, and first it was Mike calling on the house line, but we had a hotline up next to Dad's side of the bed in their bedroom. And so that rang, and I jumped up from the table, and I said, I'll go get it. And it never rang. I mean, it never rang. So when I picked up the phone, they said, "This is the White House calling. Is Jerry Ford there, or Congressman Ford there?" And I said, "Oh, let me get him." So Dad came up. I screamed down the stairs like most juniors in high school do. Dad, come get the phone. And I said, "Dad, and it's the White House calling." Well, I wasn't there to see Mother's expression, but I'm sure it was not good, put it that way, because she had been promised that he was going to retire. And so Dad came up and he said, excuse me, to President Nixon, "There's no extension on this phone, and I would like Mother to hear you share the news. Could you please call back on the other phone?" Well, Mother's on the other phone with Mike. And so Dad comes down and says, "Mother, get off the phone. President Nixon's going to be calling." And so she gets off the phone with Mike, and I won the $5 bet. So.
I love that story. The book almost started with that story, but it is in there. So, and so, as Susan said, Jerry had promised Betty that he was going to retire. He was going to run one more time, and so now he is going to become vice president. And he says, "Don't worry, Betty. Vice presidents don't do anything anyway." Well, as we all know, history intervened, and on August 9th, 1974, this is when they were saying goodbye to the Nixons, and Pat Nixon is whispering to your mother, "You'll get so you hate these red carpets." But your mother recalled that as the saddest day of her life. And why do you think that is?
Well, she'd been promised she was going to retire. They were going to retire, and everything was, the kids were almost grown and gone. And, me being a junior in well, by then I was a senior in high school, they were going to be able to start their life. And they had started their life so late in life anyway. And so I just think she was very afraid of what he was walking into. And, once again, he shined like a star and put it all together. So,
as it turned out, they were the perfect couple to heal the nation at that terrible time. And, there was just, the long national nightmare was finally over. But then, just 7 weeks later, Betty went with her personal assistant, Nancy Howe. Nancy Howe had a doctor's appointment to her annual exam, and she said, "Betty, you've been so busy this last year. I know you haven't been to the doctor. Come along with me." Well, the doctor found a suspicious lump in her breast. And it was devastating to you as a family.
Well, it was. It was the size of a pea. So, it certainly wasn't stage 1. And most women at that time in their life, she was 60-some years old, didn't survive. This is 1975, and women with stage 2 breast cancer didn't survive. So we were pretty devastated and pretty convinced that she wasn't going to survive, because that's not what happens. So, but she did, as we all know. So.
And this was a time when you couldn't say breast on television. Right. People whispered about cancer. But Betty Ford, instead of keeping this very personal diagnosis private, she was adamant that the White House put out a statement explaining exactly what was going on, because she said, "There are thousands of other women just like me going through this, and I need to share this with them." And literally overnight, Betty Ford changed women's health care forever. Yep. Because as soon as she came out and said that, and then her diagnosis or her prognosis was good because of early detection, women around the country lined up at their doctor's offices to get breast exams, and the mail came pouring in thanking her for being open about her personal issue. So what this did for Betty was, she realized then, okay, as First Lady, I have a platform. I can do something for good. And so what was one of her big causes?
The Equal Rights Amendment, which still hasn't passed out there.
Still has not passed.
She's still working on it from up above, I'm sure.
And it wasn't always popular, with your dad's administration. They really didn't want the wife of the president going out speaking about policy issues. But your mom didn't care, really.
No, she
said,
didn't.
I'm going to do it anyway.
Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, who were chief of staff and all, they were a little frustrated with her because she was calling from her office upstairs in the White House, and she was calling congressmen and senators. And they
were
not,
protesters.
Yes.
Outside.
And there were protesters outside of the White House. And so Mother was calling congressmen and senators to get their votes for the Equal Rights Amendment. And so Don and Dick were not happy, and so they went to my dad and they said, could you ask her to tone it down just a little bit? And he looked at them and he said, you go tell her to tone it down. So what she did, she said, if you don't want me calling from the White House, put an outside line in. And she put an outside line in at her cost, and she called the congressmen and senators from her outside line. So.
Go Betty. I love that. So she also brought dancing back to the White House. All of a sudden, state dinners were the most coveted invitation again, because in the Nixon White House, they weren't apparently as fun. But they were really fun during the Ford administration. And this is a photo of her dancing with Prince Philip. Were you at that state dinner with Queen Elizabeth?
Yes, it was the year of the bicentennial. And it was the only white tie state dinner that we had because it was the Queen and Prince Philip. And it was in a tent outside on the yard of the White House. It was a beautiful evening, except for the fact that, oh shoot, I can't think of the name of the band that was in the entertainment, and the first song they played was Muskrat Love. That was the Carpenters.
Right.
That's who it was.
Yeah.
And my mother was like, oh, really? That's not quite what I had in mind.
And then I think there was a dance where the Queen was dancing with your father, and they played Lady is a Tramp.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, they just had an order of music that they were going to, and it was just pure coincidence, but they got a lot of flack for that one.
Yes, they did.
So in my research, one of the great things I got to do was at the Ford Presidential Museum, they have all of your mother's gowns. Well,
there's
you
not
have
enough room for all of
them.
her clothes.
But so, I got to go and really see the beautiful clothes. And so that helped me as a writer to be able to describe things in more detail and just got a real sense. So after Jimmy Carter won the election in 1976, your parents decided to retire out here in Rancho Mirage. And they had been coming out here for years.
Years.
But it wasn't a permanent home for them. They didn't have permanent friends here. And this is people come here seasonally. So again, I went out to the home where your parents lived, and it had been sold. And I didn't knock on the door this time. I actually contacted the owners ahead of time and asked if I could tour the house, which they graciously allowed me to do. And when you sold the house, there was still a lot of memorabilia in the house.
Well, they had asked whatever we didn't want that they would like to keep. And so after we finished taking what we wanted, and none of us had a living room that could hold a portrait like that. Or, do you really want a portrait of your mother that's 8 feet tall hanging in your house would be the other way to look at it. So they really wanted to keep it, and so we made an arrangement for them to keep it.
And so when you walk into this home, this is what you see, this beautiful portrait of Betty Ford. So once again, I just felt her spirit was with me throughout this process. And it was during this was sort of towards the end of my research when I came down here to Rancho Mirage, and I visited the Betty Ford Center and met with administrators and got a tour. And I was trying to figure out how to start the book. And being in that house in Rancho Mirage really gave me a sense of how to start. And then I met with Caroline Coventry, who was your mother's personal assistant after the White House when they first moved to Rancho Mirage. And Caroline went through Betty's darkest time with her, which was that year following the White House. And when she and you told me the story of courage of the family to confront Mrs. Ford with her addictions and do an intervention, that's when I realized that's how this book was going to start. And I don't want you to go into the intervention, Susan, but this is the living room where it took place. And just talk a little bit about why you as a family realized that you had to do something for your mother.
Well, Mother and Dad had lived in the desert. They were living in Thunderbird Heights, had rented a house in Thunderbird Heights at the time while they were building their house next to Leonard and Nikki Firestone down on Thunderbird. And Mother's disease just progressed very quickly. She didn't have any of her old Washington, D.C. friends with her anymore. My dad was off traveling a lot, playing golf a lot, and she was alone. And she was very lonely. And it was just, and doctors here, and they knew who they are, didn't say no to her. And she had 3 different pharmacies going. And, let me tell you, things were very different then. Pharmacies didn't talk to each other. You don't have the laws that we have today. You don't have all those little stickers on your painkillers and everything else. And, with the disease of addiction, 1 + 1 does not equal 2. And so if 1 pill worked, why not try 2? And it was bad. It was very bad, and her disease progressed very quickly.
And no doctor ever told her, by the way, while you're taking these strong pain medications, don't have your vodka tonic in the evening. No one ever mentioned that you shouldn't mix alcohol, and it just wasn't.
It just spiraled downhill very quickly.
So, so when you saw this drastic change in your mother, and it was Susan's idea. In fact, the family demanded to your father, we have to do something or we're going to lose Mother. And so the book opens with that. And my reason for doing that is really to pull you into the story, but I also hope that people will see their own families in this, people who are struggling with addiction and may not know how to handle it. And through the whole story, it's woven through, and I think a lot of families will see themselves, and when you realize you don't know what to do, there is a way to get help. And once you get that help and you face this very difficult thing, there can be light at the end of the tunnel and a rainbow at the end, which is gratefully what happened to Betty Ford. And as we all know, then she put her name on the Betty Ford Center, and she didn't just put her name on it.
No, she put her stamp on it, and any of you who have been through there, if you have, know that she was over there and lectured to the patients and talked to the patients, and she loved it over there. She absolutely loved it, and it meant the world to her.
And such a legacy. So, so finally, when you're working on the book, you have to figure out, well, what's going to be the book jacket? So this is what I wanted on the cover of the book, because this is Betty dancing on the cabinet room table.
The last day at the White House.
Her last full day at the White House. She was going through saying goodbye to the White House staff, and she was with photographer David Kennerly, who had become a close friend. And as they walked by the cabinet room, she said, David, I've always wanted to dance on the cabinet room table. And David said, well, Mrs. Ford, this is your last chance. And she took off her shoes, and she hopped up, and she struck a pose. And this photo was never published. No one saw it until David Kennerly was publishing his own book many years later. And then it became sort of iconic, Betty Ford dancing on the cabinet room table. So my publisher said, there's too much going on with the chandelier. She's too far away. We can't use that picture. So I searched through the roll of film, and I found that after she danced on the cabinet room table, she struck this little Zen pose, and she's got this impish grin on her face, and that became the cover of the book. So in closing, we want to bring Betty Ford alive for you. In 1975, it was the first year, or a year after your father had become president, and Betty did an interview with 60 Minutes. The whole thing is 15 minutes long, and it's really incredible if you can find it to watch. We're just going to play you a short clip, but this is what made me fall in love with Betty Ford.
Well, a year ago this weekend, Jerry and Betty Ford found themselves in the unsought position of President and First Lady. When we went to the White House to chat with Betty Ford, we expected to find, quite honestly, a rather bland and predictable political wife. We found instead an open woman with a mind of her own, prepared to talk about anything, no taboos. Among the things you have spoken out about are abortion, which is kind of a taboo subject for the wife of the president. It's one of those things
Once you
that...
ask a question, you have to be honest exactly how you feel. And I feel very strongly that it was the best thing in the world when the Supreme Court voted to legalize abortion and, in my words, bring it out of the backwoods and put it in the hospitals where it belonged. I thought it was a great, great decision.
You've also talked about young people living together before they're married.
Well, they are, aren't they?
Indeed they are. I think everyone would be fascinated to know what is the issue that where you sat Jerry Ford down and said, listen, I want you to listen.
Well, a lot of it had to do with perhaps putting a woman in the cabinet.
You won that one.
Yes, I won that one, and I'm working on another. If I can get a woman on the Supreme Court bench, then I think that I'll really be have accomplished a great deal.
Well, little did she know then how much she would accomplish after the White House. And many people have said that Betty Ford's legacy surpasses that of many presidents for what she did for women's health care, with breast cancer awareness, and of course with the Betty Ford Center. She herself has saved hundreds of thousands of lives. And we met some of them yesterday, and people were coming up to Susan yesterday in tears saying that if it wasn't for Susan's courage to have confronted her mother with the intervention and for her mother to have started the Betty Ford Center, that person said they wouldn't be alive today. So thank you, Susan. And so we'd like to take a few questions from the audience. If anybody has some questions for us, just for a few minutes.
I know there's some microphones around, so don't be shy.
Were you aware that Betty was on the Eisenhower Hospital Board? Because that's where I met her and Dolores Hope. I was on the board with them.
Yes.
Yes.
Back here, yes.
Oh, thanks for coming, both of you. Can you tell me, Susan, how your parents started coming to the desert? How did they discover it here?
They were invited by friends. Fred Wilson and Fred and Vonnie have been gone for a long time. But they had friends, and Barbara and Leanne Parma, who were longtime friends of theirs, they would come out and meet in the spring and play golf and that sort of thing. And then they got to know Lee and, Wally Annenberg. So, I mean, it's just, and Bob and Dolores, and, it just kind of goes on and on. So they just loved it out here. And the dry air was good for her arthritis.
Susan, I wanted to ask you, can you hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to ask you if you have a favorite memory of your days in the White House?
To pick one is very difficult. Probably one of my most favorite would have been, I had my senior prom at the White House. And I'm still the only person to have done that. Linda Johnson got married there, and Tricia got married there while I was too young to get married. So I had my senior prom there, which was really a special evening. That's probably my...
Anybody else? Over here.
What did she think of Nixon?
My parents were longtime friends of the Nixons because my dad and Dick Nixon had been in Congress and been in the House together for a long time. And Lisa goes into it in the book, and my mother and Pat Nixon, in those days, rolled bandages for the Red Cross and did lots of things together. And the congressional wives back then, at least when Mother was a young congressional wife, she would go up and give tours to constituents when they came from Grand Rapids. And so she would give them tours of the Capitol and take them to lunch. And, that was her way of helping my dad out. He was a young congressman, but my dad was also good friends with John Kennedy, whose office was just across the hall from him. It just wasn't like it is today. Everybody got along and you were friends.
But one of the things that when she said the saddest day of her life was when she became First Lady was she felt so bad for Pat Nixon, for what Pat was going through, because she really was a good friend, and the humiliation of it all really bothered her.
Exactly. And a lot of people don't realize Pat Nixon did a lot for the White House. She doesn't get credit for it, but Pat Nixon helped them acquire a lot of the original furnishings that had been lost and sold over the years. Jackie Onassis gets a lot of credit for it also, but Pat Nixon did a lot of things for the history of the White House.
Yeah.
Hi there. When your father passed, how did your mother survive that moment and carry on?
I was not with my father when he was passed. I was with my mother when she passed. I was astounded that she lasted 5 years past his death. I would have said 2 or 3, maybe. It's interesting that she was so determined to get the statue in the rotunda of the Capitol, where we felt he deserved to have a statue because he had served in the Capitol for 25 years. So most people who live here knew that she became pretty much a recluse. She didn't go out much. We kind of had to drag her out occasionally to get her to do things. But she pretty much stayed home. One of the things that she did is she took the flag that Dick Cheney had given her that had been on his casket, and she kept it on his pillow next to her. And it stayed there until she died, and that flag is now on the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier in the captain's cabin.
One of my favorite stories. So, well, Susan, thank you so much for sharing your memories, and thank you, Jamie, for having us. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.